Hi, everybody. Welcome. It is the top of the hour. I'm Caitlin Breedlove. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at the Women's March. And we are super excited for this conversation today with Barbara Smith and Amy Sonnie. We are going to give about 5 minutes for people to be able to load in. We know that people are coming in, and where I live in Phoenix, it's only 2 p.m. For others, folks are coming to the end of the day, and we have about 3,500 people RSVP'd for this webinar. So we're gonna just take a couple minutes and let the Zoom kind of load up. While you're waiting, if you're already here, I'm gonna repeat this in a few minutes, but we actually don't use the chat function throughout the whole webinar. But we will use it for the first 5 minutes because it's really great to get to hear from people for a few minutes on the chat. And actually our team loves to see if people just want to put in your name, where you're coming from, a little shout out. And I see that you all are doing that already, just because it's fun to get to see. I'll explain this again, but we often shut the chat down, although the Q&A will be open the whole time, because we get trolls, which is a really unpleasant thing to experience, but a strangely exciting thing when you actually think about the scale of the space and how many folks are going to get to hear from our fantastic panelists today. Yeah, y'all are just coming from all over. As you can see, Amy and Barbara, there are a lot of them. They're from a lot of places. Yeah, we're really excited. We're gonna repeat this again about 5 minutes into the hour, but this is the kickoff to a Feminist Futures political education series that we're doing, and we could not be more excited to be getting to do that with Barbara Smith and Amy Sonnie. And I am really excited to get to talk to them. I actually posted on my Instagram, I was like, I'm excited to have this conversation. And I've noticed, like, the longer I've done this work, sometimes I'm like, I think this is what I need to hear right now. And I hope that's not, forcing on everyone else. But in this case, it's extremely clear from the excitement about this conversation from our whole team and from all of you, that it's absolutely also what you all want to hear. So welcome to folks who just came in. We're going to take a couple more minutes. If you didn't hear me before, you can go ahead and put your name and where you're coming from in the chat. We're not going to have the chat open the whole time, but we're going to have it open right now. So y'all feel free to load in there. We're going to give people a couple more minutes just because for those of you who didn't hear, we have a pretty high number for the Zoom today. We have the capacity, so nobody's going to get bumped off. But we will also have our team flip this over from our Zoom account into our Facebook Live, just so folks have a sense. So there are a couple ways you can access this recording or share with friends and family. The webinar is now streaming live on Facebook. So for people who may have come in late and didn't get on the Zoom, it's going to go live as of right now. It's showing me on the screen. So if you have people who couldn't see it, people can go watch it later, and we're going to share it again for sure afterwards. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So for those who didn't hear me, which Amy and Barbara already did, I am extremely excited to be having the opportunity to moderate this conversation on feminism beyond white supremacy, where we've been and where we need to go, with Barbara Smith and Amy Sonnie. I'm gonna give a little bit of information on the tech and the shortest frame up in the history of our webinars, honestly, and then tell you a little bit about myself and about Barbara and Amy, and just wanna say really glad that folks are with us today. So, I'm Caitlin Breedlove. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for the Women's March. I also serve as a Vice President of Movement Leadership at Auburn Seminary through our amazing partnership with Auburn. So I want to start by giving you an introduction to the tech. We welcome everyone to use the Q&A box. It's the little box at the bottom of the screen. For questions, we'll do our best to track. We're not going to be able to get to answering questions it, whole hog today. Just like to keep it real on the front because I don't want people to think that we actually can when we're not able to. But our team is going to be tracking for patterns, and we're going to reflect and incorporate as best we can, both in real time, but also as we move forward. For those on the phone, welcome. Unfortunately, you're not going to be able to see the visual of the chat, but we're really glad we're here. I know that, like me, many of you are doing all the things you need to do in a day, and maybe you want to, call in and have that shot in the arm of some politics and some amazing voices and stories, but you're doing what you got to do, so you're more than welcome to. We're glad you're here. Most of you heard me say the chat will be on for the first 5 minutes of this webinar so we can hear hellos and where you're tuning in from. We're going to turn it off in just a minute, and here's why. First, we often get trolls on the chat, which is hateful and distracting, but also what happens when you have a big amplification. And secondly, even without trolls, there's so many people on the Zoom, which is really exciting, that the chat's usually pretty distracting. But our team will be watching it, even though it'll be closed. We are providing closed captioning for this webinar tonight. Thank you so much. If you want to access this feature, there's a button at the bottom of your screen. Click it and you should be good to go. Your captioning should start and continue throughout. We have over 3,500 people signed up today. Thank you for doing whatever you had to do to be with us. We know these times are anything but normal, even normal before the normal, and there's a great deal of fear and grief and loss and chaos in so many of our lives. We're happy that you're here. I want to mention this series is made possible because of the partners we're working with on it. So a lot of thanks to Planned Parenthood, Auburn, NARAL, Moms Rising, Supermajority, Ultraviolet, and United States of Women, not only for supporting the resourcing of this, but amplifying, supporting us with tech, and collaborating in many other ways. So we are going to jump in and get started. I'm Caitlin Breedlove. It's always awkward to be the one that has to read your own bio, but it kind of rolls a little easier. So since 2003, I've been organizing and making social change in red states in the United States, working across race, class, culture, gender, sexuality, and faith. I'm the former co-director of SONG, Southerners and New Ground, where for almost a decade I had the profound privilege of co-leading innovative intersectional organizing, primarily in the LGBTQ community, including leading campaigns, training hundreds of leaders, building a membership of over 3,000, and helping SONG to become the largest grassroots LGBTQ organization in the US South, although we think of ourselves as a lot more than just LGBTQ. I began my organizing work in the South at the Historic Highlander Center in Tennessee, and I host the podcast Fortification, where our team interviews movement leaders and organizers about their spiritual lives. In addition to serving as the Chief Strategy Officer of the Women's March, I'm the Vice President of Movement Leadership at Auburn Seminary, and I currently live in Phoenix, Arizona with my surly 2-year-old son. Maybe the most important sentence, or the most daily impactful sentence in my bio. I am extremely proud and honored to get to introduce you all to Barbara Smith, who is an author, activist, and independent scholar who has played a groundbreaking role in opening up a national cultural and political dialogue about the intersections of race, class, sexuality, and gender. She was among the first to define an African-American women's literary tradition and to build Black women's studies and Black feminism in the United States. She's been politically active in many movements for social justice since the 1960s. She was a co-founder of the Combahee River Collective in 1975. We are going to drop that link for sure. And of Kitchen Table Women of Color Press in 1981, the first US publisher for women of color to reach a wide national audience. She also served 2 terms as a member of the City Council in Albany, New York, from 2006 to 2013. In 2005, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. I hope that many of you out there are as appreciative as I am to have Barbara with us. I also want to introduce to you my friend and comrade, who I am so happy to have with us, Amy Sonnie. She's the author of 2 books on social justice movements. Her widely acclaimed anthology, Revolutionary Voices, introduced the country to a rising generation of queer and transgender youth activism when it was first published 20 years ago. Amy's second book, Hillbilly Nationalists, Urban Race Rebels, and Black Power, explores how poor and working class whites in 3 different communities organized significant alliances tackling racism, poverty, gender oppression, and militarism in the 1960s and 70s. Amy has worked in journalism, the arts, nonprofits, and libraries. As a co-founder of the Center for Media Justice with Malkia Cyril and Jen Soriano, Amy helped build a national network to confront media bias and advance digital rights among marginalized communities. She currently works as a librarian in the San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome, Barbara and Amy. So, as I mentioned, this is going to be the shortest framing we've ever done on one of these babies. You know, usually we do a few minutes of Women's March point of view. Today we're cutting that short because we're so honored to have these 2 guests. And we actually want to use all of our time to hear directly from them. So I only want to say 2 things. First, again, real appreciation for being with us today. Women's March is made up of everyday women activists, and part of what thrills our team and me personally the most about working in this organization is how many of you are actually new to activism and to this work. If you're not new to activism and this work, we also welcome you, but we see that as an incredibly positive thing about this organization. Second, we're going to take a few minutes, and by a few I mean less than 5, at the end of this session to tell you a little bit about the work we have coming up and invite you into that work with us if it speaks to you. So without further ado, I want to get to Barbara and Amy. We are going to do a round of 4 questions and go back and forth, and I'm going to try to not get in the middle of the weeds too much. Our first question today is for Barbara. What do you think is most important for today's feminists to understand about the history of white supremacy in the US? And what have been some roadblocks and successes in organizing diverse feminist movements, Barbara?
Well, I just want to thank you and everyone who is on staff and on the tech team, the person who's captioning, everyone who's making this possible. And of course, I want to thank everyone who's taken the time to be with us. Amy and I have not met previously, but in this new era of Zooms, we have had the opportunity to at least say hello. And I'm really excited to be in this conversation with her. So, what do people need to know about the history of white supremacy in this nation? The most important thing to understand is that it is a system. It is a system of power. It is not primarily about how people of different groups feel about each other. Usually when people in the United States talk about race or racism, if they dare to mention that word, when they do, they generally stay in the kind of realm of race relations. That is, how do people who are different from different backgrounds, particularly racial or ethnic backgrounds, how do they get along with each other? When I talk about white supremacy, as I have recently in print, when I talk about white supremacy, I make an effort to explain that it is a system that drives this nation in every aspect. It is the engine that keeps this nation running. We have other engines in our society, or other parts of the engines, you know, like if we're using the metaphor of an engine. The exploitation of women, people who are not cisgendered, heterosexual, and white, that also runs our nation. Class exploitation runs our nation, but today we're talking about specifically the racial part of that. And just for example, you know, to show how important this is, you can't talk about class in the United States unless you talk about race. That's why it's called racial capitalism. So as I said, it's a system. It's a system that operates in many ways above our heads. And as I often say when I'm doing presentations about this topic, if every single white person in the United States decided tomorrow that they were going to treat every single person of color with respect and with dignity and decency, we would still have white supremacy. And that's when you begin to look at it in a different way. Statistics, for example, around Black women's maternal mortality, and also connected, of course, directly connected to that, infant mortality. When you look at the disproportionate statistics between Black women and white women, you have to start thinking about it as like, there's something else going on here, particularly when you know that Black women who have access to good prenatal care, who are well educated, who are health conscious, also have very disproportionately poor birth outcomes. There's something else going on here. So I think that's probably enough for now. And I don't have the questions in front of me, so if I repeat them or ask you now to make sure that I don't forget anything, I think you asked about roadblocks to dealing with the reality of white supremacy in the United States. One of the problems is that, I'm going to put this in the context of second wave feminism, which is the women's movement I came into in the 1970s. So that era of women's organizing and feminism in the United States, the most visible voices and faces of what was going on at the time were usually white middle-class women. And they often did not have an understanding of how the issues that were front and center for them, and very, very important issues. No way that I would disparage the importance of those issues. They didn't understand that it looked different, felt different, and was different for people who were different racial, ethnic, nationality backgrounds, different immigration statuses, and also of different classes. So that's where we got into, I think, some issues.
I really appreciate, Barbara, how you're also naming lived experience, and when things are moving up over our head, how actually people are experiencing different lived experience and the role that plays in the history. Amy, let's move to you. What do you think is most important for today's feminists to understand about the history of white supremacy in the US? And what do you think have been some roadblocks and successes in organizing diverse feminist movements?
First, I just want to say thank you. It's really, it's an honor to be in dialogue with Barbara, who I've learned so much from over the years, even though we've never met in person, just through the power of Barbara's writing and work. And also with you, Caitlin, through all the years that we've known each other and through your work in song and beyond. So I just want to say thank you for having me, to both of you. I really appreciate Barbara's framing and answer to this question. In my work, in multiracial spaces and also working with white folks, this question on what is white supremacy and what is that legacy does come up a lot. And I've interacted with a lot of folks who, maybe even like some folks today, it's obvious why we use the term white supremacy. System is a structure of power that defines advantage and disadvantage, that defines people's access to opportunity, not just historically. I've also interacted with a lot of people, including members of my own family, who might be like, that's an abrasive term. That's, you're describing extremists, right? Are we talking about the KKK? Or even what we saw in Charlottesville in 2017. And I think it's really important that we let go of that idea, that we understand that white supremacy is a spectrum, and that white supremacy is foundational. It defines our society, and it shows up in policy, in practice, in our thinking, in our relationships, and in our culture, and is pervasive in that way. So while we might see, racial categories or, aspects of racism, or who's, the current sort of scapegoat shift over time historically, the history of immigration in this country is a great example of how racial categories can shift. There is an underlying undercurrent of white supremacy in this country that has not moved, and that only moves inch by inch in response to pressure, in response to social movement and organizing. And it's a reason why it's so important that we do build the movements that we build with an understanding that race, class, gender, and other forms of exclusion and oppression need to be addressed simultaneously. So that I think about that stuff a lot. It's part of the work that I do. And in thinking about today, sort of, how would I answer that question about white supremacy? I came back to a quote that I remembered from Gloria Anzaldúa that's about the sliding scale of human worth in this country and how it dictates, who's included and who's not, how that sliding scale of human worth is used to keep us divided. And I think that it's our work and our responsibility in addressing white supremacy and racism, and as feminists, to understand each of the weights on that sliding scale, not to choose one of them at the exclusion of the others, but to look at all of the weights on that sliding scale so that we can overcome those divisions. So your question about building diverse feminist movements and addressing like roadblocks, I think the times that we've failed to build inclusive movements have been when we've only addressed one of those weights to the exclusion of the others, right? So anyone who wants to learn more can certainly learn more about the history of the women's suffrage movement, 100 years old this year, and the ways in which some white women betrayed Black women in the pursuit of the vote. We can learn about the history of labor organizing in this country with some powerful and wonderful examples, but also in the ways that the US labor movement through the 1900s actually at multiple times refused to talk about race or include Black workers. And I think you can see the way that still shows up today, right? If you look at wage disparities in this country today, you can see the ways that, the exclusion of women of color, the exclusion of people of color from the labor movement in the early, and throughout the 20th century still shows up in wage disparities for women of color versus white women versus men in this country, even today. So, we're not talking about things that are in the past, we're talking about things that are still present. I really appreciate the example that Barbara gave too, bringing up the ways that race affects infant mortality. I would ask everyone on the call today to think about issues you care about, right? Maybe it's education and literacy, early childhood education. Maybe it's policing and police brutality. Maybe it's healthcare. Maybe it's a whole range of other issues. Think about it and ask yourself if any of those issues are untouched by issues of race and racism and white supremacy in this country. And the answer is no. Race continues to be a defining factor and a key determinant around access, opportunity, and power across pretty much every issue any of us could be activated to care about.
I think it's really helpful how both of you came at having a conversation about structure, so that, we discussed in some of the lead up to this, like vocabulary shifts, or as Barbara put it, people being nicer to each other across race and across class doesn't change the structures. One of the things that I've been reflecting a lot about, I actually was reflecting on it this week and thinking about how much I appreciate the grounding of being in conversation with both of you, is how, as not a historian or a writer, nearly as much as either of you, the benefit of understanding history, and sometimes I have been able to play a helpful role in work by being able to carry stories to bases of folks who are really not actually engaged in history in a particular way. And one of the examples of that I think is so critical is actually very much in your lived experience and leadership, Barbara. And so I am wondering if you could talk to us about the origins of the Combahee River Collective, its core principles, including interconnected oppression and identity politics. And some people don't know where the actual river is, which I would be remiss after 17 years in the South, though I live in Phoenix now, to please tell us where the river is so everybody knows.
These are wonderful questions. I do have a tech issue. It's hard for me to hear Amy. I can hear you fine, Caitlin, but I'm not sure what happens with Amy's audio. I don't know if there's anything that can be done about that, but I just wanted to bring it up because it's, I want to be able to hear well.
I'll see if I can fix it.
Great.
Okay. Great. So, origins of Combahee. Where is the Combahee River? the Combahee River is in South Carolina, and I found out just a few years ago, a couple of years ago, that for all these decades, those of us who started the collective, who were in it, you know, all kinds of people who know the name Combahee, we've been pronouncing it wrong all these years. I heard a podcast about the action that Harriet Tubman led on the Combahee River during the Civil War. She was a scout for the Union Army, and she planned and helped to execute a raid on the Combahee River, on plantations that were along the river that freed more than 750 enslaved people. And when I read about that back in the day, before we came up with our name, I said, that's what we should be talking about, you know, talking about Black women doing militant actions for liberation. And so that's how we chose the name. But as I said, I heard a podcast about that history, and everyone who was on the podcast, and they interviewed a lot of people who were from South Carolina, and they all pronounced it correctly, which is Combahee, as if it only has 2 syllables, Combahee. So all these years, as I said, pronouncing it wrong. And I always say, and I continue to pronounce it incorrectly because most people recognize it as such. But I say we pronounce it the way that young Black women living in the Northeast thought it would be pronounced, because we looked at it and we said, that's 3 syllables. Yeah, okay, fine, great, whatever. But I've actually been there. I actually went there once and was more than intrigued, and that's a nice way to put it, with the crocodiles that were in and around that river. Not a happy camper that day, I have to say. I wasn't camping either, but just they were around. So now you know where the name came from. We started, we were originally a chapter of the National Black Feminist Organization, and we became an independent organization in 1975. We're best known probably for people who were not living in Boston, where we were in the Boston area at that time. We're best known for writing the Combahee River Collective Statement. And that was written in 1977. I think it was actually published about a year or so later. We wrote it for a book. The book is edited by Zillah Eisenstein, a anti-racist feminist political scientist and friend. And we wrote it for her book, Capitalist Patriarchy. Listen to this title, people. Capitalist Patriarchy and the Case for Socialist Feminism. So that's why we wrote this statement. Now, the reason I believe, and I say this, you know, frequently, the reason the statement is still useful today, I believe, is because we were socialists and we had a materialist analysis of what was going on. We were not just fascinated by the fact that we were these fierce Black women, almost all young. One of us was middle-aged, in her 40s, my goodness. And we looked up to that person, of course. But we weren't just fascinated and intrigued by the fact that we had all of these cool identities. That wasn't what we were about. We were about making actual substantive change. We came out of the left. We had been involved in organizing in the civil rights movement, the Black Panthers, in work around international solidarity and for peace against the war in Vietnam. We had a lot of experiences under our belts, so to speak, at the time that we started organizing together. And as I said, we actually thought that, no, it was not enough for people to have nice feelings, again, kind of like with racism. It wasn't enough for them to think like, oh yeah, Black women, women of color, they're really okay. Yeah, we are okay, we were okay, we are okay. But we understood that there were systems that were standing in the way of our freedom and our liberation. And we wrote about the fact that the systems of oppression are interlocking. That's in the Combahee River Collective Statement. And many people say that's like the roots of intersectionality. We now use the term intersectionality that was created by legal scholar Kim Crenshaw, but that was like late 80s, and in the mid 70s, we said that the systems of oppression are interlocking and that those systems create the conditions of our lives. We talked about the simultaneity, that is a fact that oppression happens simultaneously when you have multiple oppressed identities. And we talked about the simultaneity of oppression, the simultaneity of oppressions. We also talked about identity politics. I don't know if I should say more about that, or we should leave that for the next go round.
Tell us just a little bit about that, Barbara, because I actually think the way you speak to it is extremely helpful for me. So just a little bit about that.
Okay. As far as we know, we were the people who coined the term identity politics. I've asked many people over the decades if they have ever seen it anywhere else, if they've ever read it anywhere else. And no one can attribute it anywhere except for its origins in the Combahee River Collective Statement. The term has been taken and distorted. It has been attacked. Very few people who use it actually understand what it is. And that includes people who are on our side. What we meant by identity politics is that we had the right as people who were simultaneously women, Black, from working class homes, and in most cases, lesbians, the term we used at that time, that people who had those various identities, that we actually had a right to build our own political agendas. That our identities, which also were contested political statuses and social statuses, that our identities put us in situations that if we didn't form our own political agendas, we would never get anywhere. Because during that period, Black politics were defined primarily by males, and women's politics or feminist politics were defined by white women. So we just disappeared. We were nowhere. So that's what we meant by identity politics. And people have taken it like there's this phrase, "You've done taken my blues and gone. You've done taken my blues and gone." Well, they took identity politics and we've been blue ever since, you know? That is in the sense of being not happy with what they did with it. I also believe that not everyone who uses the term identity politics, particularly when they're hostile to it, antagonistic to it, I don't necessarily believe that they got it from reading the Combahee River Collective Statement. Far from it. I think that it's a kind of rich enough concept that people could latch onto it and maybe even just come up with it themselves. There might be some connection between it being in print and certain right-wingers who were in college, like in the 1980s, finding out about it, hearing about it, and saying, "Oh no, we're going to attack that." You know, that may be how it got into the right-wing's hands. But I don't believe that everybody who talks about it has read the statement. And in fact, because they're so inaccurate about what it is, proves practically that they haven't read the statement.
I think it's just incredibly important for the kind of audience for this webinar to understand a tree. You have to understand its roots. And I think that, you know, the question of really where that politic has come from and the message for right now, I've actually been really glad to hear you speaking publicly about it recently, Barbara. We're going to send some articles after this webinar is done. There's a piece in the New Yorker recently. There's Teen Vogue recently, because the true understanding of those ideas are badly needed now. And that brings me into my next question for you, Amy, which is obviously close to my heart because I consider us the same generation. Can you tell us about the impact of these ideas on your generation, maybe our generation, and how intersectionality has shaped your work, writing, and sense of possibility?
Yeah, thank you. And hopefully my audio is a little better. I can lean in a little bit too.
Barbara,
Um,
can you hear more? I can hear a little better.
is it a little better?
It is better.
Okay, good.
It is
I
better.
played with some settings and did some things, and I also agree that it's so important that there's been more writing, more articles by Barbara herself, but also about, I think it's Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor wrote a wonderful book about, am I going to say it right? Combahee. Combahee River Collective, now that we're learning how to say things properly. And there's just been so much more discussion about this, because this is one of the ways that oppression and that division operates, right? Which is to take the concepts and take the things that we have used in social movements and moved as leftists and use to help organize ourselves or speak for ourselves, and to distort them and take them away from us. And then we have to fight to take them back. And I think identity politics and this idea of interconnected oppressions is really one of those. We can't let the original intent of that idea, as Barbara just described it, be lost. And I can say that for myself, I can't speak for my whole generation, but maybe I'm speaking for you and I, Caitlin, when I say that I wouldn't be who I am today if it weren't for the work of Barbara and her peers. From Gloria Anzaldúa to Audre Lorde to Bell Hooks, and even folks like Grace Lee Boggs, and international feminist scholar Chandra Mohanty, and all of these women who shaped this idea of an intersectional, even global feminist identity. The influence of Black feminism and women of color feminism on me as a young person was really profound. And in a close reading of that work, and I want to name too, I'm one of those like everyday women. I'm not an academic or a scholar. Like even the books that I've written, I was working 2 and 3 jobs, which is why they each took me 10 years. I wrote them as an activist looking for a way to speak into being the ideas that my generation was struggling with, or to look to movements of the past to recover our stories and our role models so that we could learn from the lessons and the failures. They were labors of love, not of a PhD. So I just want to say that because I think it's important that while there's lots of books or authors or scholars that we point to, this is not an academic exercise. What it is about seeking the language and the stories that help us understand more of who we are, where we've been, so we can imagine where we're going. And I'm incredibly indebted. I read and reread everything that Kitchen Table Press ever published. And I've come back to some of the key definitions in that work time and time again. Early, definitions of feminism as, as a movement, not an identity that you hold, but a movement. And a movement that doesn't neglect or exclude questions of race and class, gender oppression, and questions about imperialism and war and the global context. And I think it's Bell Hooks that I'm quoting and saying that, feminism is a movement to end sexist oppression that does not neglect those other things. And so my understanding of identity politics then and intersectionality was that both were invitations, not exclusions. It wasn't that as a young white queer woman, I was being asked to like sit down and shut up and, go home. I was being invited into a conversation where I listened first, where I understood more about myself and my family, and the ways that my various identities shaped me, and to ask more questions of my peers and others so that I could learn more about what shaped them. So I think this idea that identity politics divides us into these like single issues and separate spaces really didn't reflect any of what I understood from my early experiences with feminism and with the scholarship and activism that Barbara is talking about. And I think it was really reinforced for me. All of that was really reinforced for me as a young, feminist activist when I started researching for my second book, which, I was in a study group. It was around challenging white supremacy. And we started looking at the ways that, anti-racist work showed up in women's movements or in labor. Or in my case, I was really interested in understanding more about how poor white Southerners came to be in a coalition with the Black Panthers. Like, how did that happen? What was the basis upon which they even met each other? And, seeing these kind of flashpoint moments in history and using that as a bit of curiosity to start research set me off on like a 10-year journey of really trying to understand how these coalitions came to be. And as I researched them, what I understood more was that the coalitions emerged because that the before intersectionality was intersectionality, the concept was there, right? The idea of go and organize your own people. So organize in poor white communities. You've learned a lot from civil rights, being in the civil rights movement. And here I'm speaking of white folks who were in active participants in supporting civil rights. There came a moment when it was like, what about organizing your own communities, talking to your own families, your own neighborhoods, because neighborhoods were and still are very segregated. That idea wasn't, we don't need you. It was an invitation to do more work, to understand who you are and to have difficult conversations to address racism, often where it's born, but to do that in a way that, tackles race, class, gender, and other forms of exclusion together so that everyone could come into alliance.
I think it's really helpful, Amy, and I love how you also brought in the personal of how long it took to write the books and the process, what that looks like when you're working two jobs. I think that one of the reasons these conversations are so critical is how does it actually land in the lived everyday experience. And I for sure remember, coming from a family that had ascended into the middle class, but neither of my grandparents were able to read or write well. And, my mom was an immigrant from Eastern Europe. And I remember being at Highlander Center, like maybe when I was like 21, which for folks who don't know is in Tennessee, and literally talking about the ideas of Barbara and her contemporaries. And I remember sitting there thinking, I was taking notes, on the laptop. And I remember thinking, I'm never going to be smart enough to say anything in this group with these people. Like, I don't know what they're talking about, but I know there's something. I will follow it to the end of the earth, but I don't understand it yet, and I don't think I should talk. I still know some of those folks, and I say, all the time, I think that like that's a sacred process when people, so much of Southern organizing in Black traditions, folks are saying like, you're looking for the people that are looking for you. We would organize in little gay bars. It's like we're looking for the folks who are looking for us. They're looking for us. They're out there. And I think that it's incredibly powerful when I think about the kind of vision and frankly, some of the reckoning that Barbara's talking about that sets us back on a path where having deep political grounding is actually where in a moment folks are longing for it and looking for access and space to it. So the next question, actually, full transparency, I was in the grocery store and I was talking to Barbara, and Barbara said, I would really love to be asked this. And I said, okay, I'm going to ask that question because I think it's a great question. And I think she's one of the best people I've ever heard answer a question like this. And the question is, why, as a Black feminist, do you not feel comfortable singling out white feminists to be responsible for white supremacy? And where have you seen or participated in examples of anti-racist feminism that have inspired you?
Well, thank you for letting me answer the question that we've already discussed. One of the reasons I don't like doing that is because it's ahistorical, which means it's not historical. It confuses, what's actually going on here. And one of the things I didn't have a chance to say when I was talking about the origins of white supremacy, and this is a very, very important point. White supremacy did not, and let's just call it, for this purpose, call it racism, racist ideas did not arise first. And then people say, oh, there's some of those other kind of people over there. Let's annihilate them if they're indigenous, genocide, and or remove them. Or if they're another kind of people from Africa, let's enslave them. That's not how it happened. The economic imperatives of what was needed to settle this stolen land required a workforce, a huge workforce. It was primarily agricultural, of course, and the people who stole the land, the Europeans, who created this settler colony, they were trying to figure out how do we work this land. And they tried to exploit the indigenous people for purposes of their labor. But that, you know, they also were bent on taking the land and destroying the people whose land it actually is. And then they hit upon the idea of like importing people from Africa, importing them as if they were, you know, bales of something or other, or barrels of something or other. That is treating us and enslaving us as if we were not human, that we were property. But as I said, the economic needs, you know, what was needed by those settlers in order to work this land and extract the wealth from it, that's what started. And then they had to come up with an ideology to justify what under any other circumstances would have been criminal, inhumane, and condemned. They had to come up with mythology, myths about who certain people were to justify what in other circumstances that the people were white, they wouldn't do it quite so cavalierly. So first things first, economic imperative for exploiting the land, and then we have to come up with an ideology of white supremacy and an airtight system of power to keep that in place. So that's one thing I didn't get a chance to say before. Now, why do I not think it's helpful necessarily to single out white feminist as the major focus of challenge around white supremacy? Because it's not about movement building. That's why the original, and I guess I'm doing full disclosure here, the original description of this afternoon for me, I guess afternoon for everyone, the original description of this afternoon's conversation did single out white feminism as if there was something particular about white feminism that was absolutely destructive to anything that we would think of as liberation. I'm not saying that white women who identify as feminists do not have responsibility for eradicating racism and white supremacy. They absolutely do. And I've tried to help them do it for about 40 years now. So it's not that I don't think that that's what should be going on. It absolutely should. But what we have now are some very simplistic understandings of what we are actually working on. And I don't know if social media is the cause or the manifestation of it. I see these kinds of understandings and these kinds of statements on social media. And it goes something like this. 53% of white women voted for Beelzebub in chief, the devil, 45. 53% of white women voted for him. Therefore, all white women are culpable and they are our enemy. All of them, all white women, because 53% voted. Now, the 47% who did not vote for him, nobody ever talks about them. Nobody's curious about them. Nobody wonders, why did 47% of white women vote differently from the 53? 53 and 47 are not statistically significant numbers in comparison to each other. They are 6 points apart. I'm not saying that the 53% who went along with the white supremacist okey doke of this administration and of his campaign I'm not saying that they don't have a lot to answer for. They absolutely do. But we can't build politics about that. It's hard to build politics about that. And like simplistic anti-whiteness erases history. We haven't talked about the abolitionist movement. We haven't talked about the civil rights struggle. We haven't talked about the things that Amy has written about and has brought to us about working class white people of every gender who were down with the Panthers and who were down with Black liberation. We don't ever talk about that in this nation because nobody wants us to know. There were tenant farmers, sharecroppers in the South in the early 1900s who formed tenants unions together, Black and white tenant farmers. Now, you know the establishment did everything possible to destroy those alliances because it doesn't work for them. It doesn't work for the ruling class to have people of different backgrounds banding together, looking at what's wrong and saying, you know what, I think together we can fix this or we're gonna die trying. They don't like that. Whenever people of different backgrounds, and there are many, there's much diversity. We haven't talked about all the forms of diversity that we embody in our beautiful movements. But whenever people come together, the system, the ruling class, the people in power, they say, no, 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 no. We have got to stop that. We got to nip that in the butt. And the ideology of white supremacy has been very effective in that because the class interests of poor people of every background are similar, parallel. We have these similar class interests, but if you can throw some white supremacy into the mix, then the poor white person who can't afford both food and housing and heat and electricity, when you pit that person against the person who's dealing with the very same thing but has a different racial ethnic background, you got us behind the 8 ball. So that's kind of why I don't see that simplistic way of looking at things. I'm about struggle.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I actually think that last piece I was thinking about when they said I'm about struggle, that these politics, it's a transformative process. It's a process of transformation. That's why it's called that, right? And so everything from putting together this piece to everything that's happening in this political moment of a triple pandemic and all of these aspects, I actually think that's the refinding and re-knowing and having that kind of, really it's about political clarity, I think, to be able to say, okay, like this is actually how we want to engage. We refuse to have this be a simplistic point of view of how we're thinking about race or class or how we're thinking about lived experience and identity, period. Because that to me actually feels like, and to really keep it very real, what we're struggling with inside of the questions of organizing right now. Do people move when they feel guilty, when they feel shamed, when they feel that they're not supposed to speak? Do they move? I think you said something, I might be paraphrasing you wrong here, Barbara, and I'm sure you tell me. But I think this question of, are we movement building or are we commentators? Are we critics, right? Because there's only a few roles there. Then there's the role of critics or there's the role of followers who are supposed to be quiet and do what they're told. But the political question we're engaging here is how to have actually folks feel alive and animated in the struggle in a way that, as Amy spoke to, actually transforms the way that we feel about ourselves, each other, and what's possible. Like, to me, that's so much at the heart of organizing, right? That sense of belonging, purpose, meaning, and how do we engage that? And I think what's so powerful in this time, Barbara, is actually the question of, there's only 6 points between, 53 and 47, is also a question of, with this election coming up, is it, this is what white women or many constituencies have done wrong, or is it, this is what's possible and what we could do if we move in multiracial alliance? And so I feel inspired by the struggle, even in the conversation right now in this political moment, and how we have the political courage, which frankly I think that it's extremely helpful to sort of have this conversation and to have this conversation repeatedly and have it with an audience in order for folks to move forward in that space. Amy, I want to hear from you. You know, obviously I got kind of excited about what Barbara was saying, so I had a few thoughts in a shocking turn of events, but I want to hear from you also on this. So where have you seen or participated in examples of anti-racist feminism that have inspired you, and what does it mean to you to be an anti-racist feminist, and you know, sort of what's on your heart in terms of the vein of this conversation, this part of the conversation?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think this part of the conversation is so inspiring and just calling forward so much of what I care about, teaching me so many things, because I think that this piece right here, like, is the crux of it. And I just, in a way, I'm like, we just got a masterclass from Barbara, and I just, like, I hope that everybody, like, goes back and reads the transcripts and the, you know, the captions, and really sits with what Barbara just said, which is about the history of this country and the ways in which divide and conquer has been used, and the ways in which that still shows up in our work, and that we then, in every generation, including this one, have a choice. Are we tearing things down and defining what we're against, or are we building a movement and defining what we're for? And it's harder to do that. You have to have an imagination to do that. You have to have a radical imagination to imagine, you know, that phrase, another world is possible. What does that other world look like? And I think that divide and conquer can get in our way. I think that ahistorical framing can get in our way. And I think that the quickness to take down, call out, and define what we're against or what we're critical of can get in our way of really tapping into the much harder work is the radical imagination, the imagining what else is possible. And so for me, like, as I've already said, looking to movements of the past and looking at the, you know, the powerful examples of people coming together, multiracial coalitions, anti-racist feminism, where did people stumble and fall, where did they succeed? Those things help spark my imagination. And so, because Barbara mentioned it, we can talk about abolitionists, right? There's a rich and strong history of abolition in this country, including white folks who put their lives on the line alongside Black folks in this country for abolition. There's an abolition movement now that we can also talk about that's really important. And there were, you know, I talked about suffrage earlier. There were white women who broke with the suffrage movement over its racism, who defined a more radical path, and because they did so, their names get dropped off, right? They were at Seneca Falls, but we don't talk about them anymore. I'm thinking about Matilda Jocelyn Gage and women like her, and I'm speaking about white women because that's where I'm coming from in terms of looking for these examples of a different way to be. And then there was, you know, socialist labor organizations and the IWW, the International Workers of the World, that we can learn about. There's so many examples throughout history where people did try to define an interracial or multiracial cross-class unity. And we often don't know about them. I think Barbara said it really well, because they don't want us to. And so, you know, the process of writing my book and looking at powerful examples of cross-class unity and interracial organizing, much of which was led by women, and some of which was decidedly feminist, more over time as the women's movement grew and as working class women defined their own version of feminism, before intersectionality was a term. You know, throughout into the 70s, their work was decidedly feminist. So I'm thinking about Rising Up Angry in Chicago. There was an organization also in Philadelphia called the October 4th organization that was deeply rooted in the Kensington community, and a long tradition of workers' rights and organizing there. And they were working in direct alignment with the Third World Women's Alliance in the early 70s, and distributing a paper that the Third World Women's Alliance published called Triple Jeopardy. So they were struggling with these questions, not letting themselves be divided, really looking at and defining what I would consider an anti-racist feminism. And I think we need to look to those stories, and then we need to locate what those inspiring, anti-racist feminist examples are now. I really want to hear what Barbara has to say about that. I think you asked us to say like what inspires us or what have we participated in. I don't want to go on too long, but I will say that I'm personally inspired by the clarity of vision and feminist organizing that I see happening in today's abolition movement around the policing and prisons and the prison industrial complex. I think it's really important for people to understand that the call to defund the police comes from an anti-racist feminist tradition and set of activism and organizing going back to the 90s and even before, and that to understand that those are feminist struggles and feminist fights.
Really helpful, Amy. I think for this final question, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is this question of, when the time comes, when suddenly the wheel turns and a lot more people are talking about ideas that I don't know how the two of you feel about this, but I feel like 5, 10, 15 years ago, and maybe Barbara in the longer trajectory, like we're not being talked about. They were not in popular culture. They weren't even being contested. It wasn't about, was it our political position or others? And this might be overly aspirational or might be hopeful, but I have a curiosity inside of me that I've had recently about what kind of hunger there actually is for a truly deep political vision of how governments could actually be transformed, how public health and public safety systems could be transformed. And I think about that because I also think, Barbara, about your journey of serving the city council, right? And I have a couple people that I've been in relationship with who, we got excited, we ran for office and then they won. And then they were like, oh, whoa, I won. And now here we are, and have had some kind of deep conversations about the generational dynamics of like, some of those of us who we did a lot of resisting. And then all of a sudden the role of governance is there, or the questions of governance are upon us. The questions of what is the narrative that's actually pushing this time is upon us. Like the questions, Amy, you put it of like, what are we aspiring for? What do we want to build? And I think that the importance of looking to history and also being in this moment are really important. So I say all that to say that I want to ask you both, starting with Barbara, what do you see as the possibilities and opportunities for anti-racist feminism now? And I also want to say, if there's more around possibility and opportunity outside of the box of that question, possibilities and opportunities right now, want to hear about that broadly. But that was the question as we had it. So Barbara, let's start with you.
Thank you. This is such a great conversation this afternoon, at least for me. I hope it is for everyone else too. I wanted to, Amy kind of concluded her last remarks talking about the current abolition movement, or abolitionist movement, which is around the criminal injustice system and the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration and police brutality. So that's what abolition means now. And the people who are leading that, have been at the forefront of that, are people in the Black Lives Matter movement and the movement for Black Lives. Thank goodness. Just imagine where we would be in the summer of 2020 if the movement for Black Lives did not exist, and if it had not come into existence about 6 years ago, with the lynching, the visible, horrific, on-camera lynching of George Floyd. Where would we be? Where would we be? We wouldn't have the analysis. We wouldn't have the terminology. We wouldn't have the organizations. There's so many things that would not have been in place that could make this such a transformative moment in the history of racial discourse in this nation, and or as I refer to it, in the history of the ongoing race war that is this nation. We are a nation always in perpetual race war. Not acknowledged, but that's what's going on. And when we see what happens to George Floyd, when we see what happens to Breonna Taylor, when we see what happens to Ahmaud Arbery, when we see what happens to Rayshard Brooks, we know we're in a race war. And those are just the people whose names we know who have been murdered during this period of this extreme period of pandemic. So the leadership, of the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter, they often are self-described as queer women of color. That's who they are, and they also assert that they're feminist. And what's fascinating about that is that this is a movement that has the leadership of people who have identities, including identifying as feminists, who are women, trans and cis women, not gender non-conforming, non-binary, all kinds of women of color. And the focus of their organizing is not around gender and sexuality issues. It's around issues of police brutality, state-sanctioned violence, and mass incarceration. This is a break point in history. This is a break point because one of the things I used to say, I could still say it to some extent, is that the kind of leaders, John Lewis, his funeral was today. His interment, I assume, has occurred by now. And, people are talking about, that way back, getting the way back machine, talking about how things were. And when people would talk about, why don't we have any great leaders, like the leaders of my youth in the 1960s and the civil rights movement, I said, we have them. It's just that we're not allowed to lead. We have them. You're looking at them, but we're not allowed to lead because we're not in the right package. We are not cisgendered, supposedly heterosexual Black men. We're here, okay, but the thing is, like, now we have a global movement of Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives, that started here in the United States, where the people, who are in the wrong package, so to speak, not in the right package, they're the leaders of it. And also, we're not into the charismatic leader of it all. So that's fantastic. So you're asking, like, where can you do anti-racist work? I just told you. you can be involved with what's happening now on the ground. What's happening now is a reckoning around white supremacy and race war in the United States. I don't know what's going to happen next. I wish I did. What concerns me is that we don't have really easy ways to be in a dialogue with each other during this period because of the pandemic. I understand, I read about a virtual, I assume it's mostly virtual conference that the Movement for Black Lives is going to be having soon. And I was really interested to see that because there would be a lot of conferences being planned around now because of all the things that have happened politically. It's hard for us. What's going to be the theory of change? Is it voting only? Is it something else? Serious political dialogues that need to happen. All of you live somewhere, so mostly in the United States. I think I saw Ontario, Canada, but most of us live here, and Canada has its own history of these issues as well. And that means that there are things going on where you live that you can get involved in. And you can do that from a feminist perspective, because our perspective as feminists is very, 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 very much needed when we come into other spaces, because we need to be able to pull people's coats around. Oops, you forgot. Oh, are you actually saying, we've seen some really bad things happen around transphobia specifically during this period, because people just don't get it. So we have a lot to speak out about. We have a lot to offer. And I went off there, but I'm sorry, I just had to go off.
I think it's actually very critical given the moment that we're in. Amy, I want to turn to you for the same question. What are the possibilities and opportunities for anti-racist feminism now? Other opportunities, possibilities you see?
I think that we shape those opportunities and possibilities where we live, right? The fight against white supremacy, the fight against gender oppression, the fight against poverty, and the fight to define what we're for, it happens where you live, in your town, right? So I really appreciate what Barbara called forward about the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter co-founders in particular. And it reminds me of a piece I had once seen by Alicia Garza, where she actually talked about the value of intersectionality and seeing the strategic value of our differences, right? So we all, wherever you are, get to look at and think about what is the strategic value in the differences with the folks that you can call together and come together with to solve the problems that exist in your community, and then in our nation. And so I really think that that's our job. It's our job to shape those multiracial, cross-class, gender inclusive moments and spaces to identify the issues that bring us together, and when there's issues that actually pull us apart, to make sure that we use that as an opportunity to build and to grow and to define more of how we can be together then about how we can be pulled apart. I think it's really important what Barbara brought up as well about addressing transphobia and trans violence. When I spoke earlier about the long history of the abolitionist, modern abolitionist movement here, I want to say that was one of the defining issues that brought me in to work around the prison industrial complex and police brutality, was being active around addressing police violence towards trans women and trans folks in general, and being active around the ways in which homeless queer youth end up criminalized and incarcerated at disproportionate rates. So I think that those struggles have been going on for a long time. I think they intersect with feminism in important ways. And I think it's up to us to look for and define those ways that we can connect more, to understand each other, so people can continue to self-educate, but also stay in movement and in motion. So I look a lot to the Movement for Black Lives and BLM's co-founders. I'm really inspired by the work being done by Standing Up for Racial Justice, Surge, for those of you who have a Surge chapter in your community. I think that's a place where exactly this type of intersectional, feminist and racial justice organizing can happen. The National Domestic Workers Alliance is another organization that I think really is defining what this means for our generation, that we all can support, along with organizations like Song, which still exists even though Caitlin left. It's doing really important work in the South. The Audre Lorde Project and other trans organizations across the country. I think there's a lot of places that we can learn from and support, even as we define what we want to do in our own communities.
I want to bring us back for a minute, because I know we're getting close on time, but I just want to bring us back to something Barbara said that I hope everyone is going to be taking with them, which is this idea of not in the right package. I find that incredibly compelling, and I'm going to say why. I think that this question of who was the archetype of a leader, not only a cis man, white, or perhaps Black, assumed straight, which I also always appreciate that, Barbara. I appreciate that. But also this sort of charismatic individual idea. I think one of the things we've been working a lot at Women's March is, how do we think about collective leadership? There are a ton of folks in the Movement for Black Lives that we don't know their names. There are a ton of people in movement right now, that have actually been in action, and that have been with Masson out there, demonstrating and moving and doing all of the work that's seen and unseen in all these different ways. And so for those folks out there who maybe think that they're not the package that leadership comes in. I thought I wasn't the package that leadership came in for a long time, because I was queer, because I was obsessed with working in red states, or, because I didn't come from the same class background, frankly, as a lot of people that I came into in movement. We're redefining what the package is. And that's part of the gift of what Barbara has given us and what Amy's given us in this conversation. And it's a time where I think it's a time for a lot of ourselves to be asking ourselves and each other, like, what are the qualities of leadership we need in this time? What does that look like? How are we able to do it together? How are we going to move there? So I'm taking that along with many other lessons in this conversation. I want to wrap us up by offering a few things. One is we are going to be sharing resources from Amy and Barbara. So everyone that was registered for this webinar, and sometimes folks have to jump off because they're between places, etc. But everyone who got a registration is going to get some of those resources and a link to that. We mentioned some of them. Barbara, am I saying it right? Combahee. This is so embarrassing. I lived in the South for so long.
Well, I haven't changed my pronunciation. I told you I'm pronouncing it the way I always did because I want people to recognize what it is I'm talking about.
Right.
But as I said, the people from South Carolina call it Combahee. Combahee.
We're all learning and growing together. I'm gonna pass this on. I'm gonna be like, everybody, we gotta get this together. Let's put it phonetically on the big paper. You know what I mean? Big paper brings me to my final point, which is that we made a political commitment that we were not going to do any of these webinar series without creating an invitation into organizing. There are a lot of other invitations into organizing. Amy named some of them. There's a lot of great organizations out there. We also know that what we're good at is on-ramping everyday women activists who are new to the work to come on in. So if you want to get more involved in Women's March, we want you in. Our teams are just wrapping up our first ever feminist organizing school, which covered some fundamentals of organizing for those new to this work. We're also in the process of creating our women to women local organizing circles, which are launching next week. It's going to be made up of local groups of women who want to take action on issues that matter to them, and you're invited. If you think there might not be women's marchers in your town, you might be wrong, because my mind was blown. I grew up in Wisconsin, and there's 350 people in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, who are high actives on that list. It's one of the things I absolutely adore about working with Women's March. So if you're excited or interested in that, our team is going to share the Zoom link now in the chat. But don't worry, if you're in transit, you're wrapping up, it'll be in the follow-up email as well, as part of how we're thinking about, you know, really what are the collective skills that it takes for folks to come together and work differently. We've heard from many of our folks, you know, life is feeling pretty, the house, the block, the neighborhood, the local right now. And we want to make sure that we are doing our part to connect people where they actually are. We also want to let you know we're going to send a recording of this webinar in that same follow-up email later this week. And you can also get it on our Facebook page. And we're going to make sure the resources get in there as well, as we mentioned before. So I want to make sure, in saying and closing out, that I believe in a politic that is collective and not about any one of us alone. And that's also the politics we're working to advance and build at the Women's March. You know, difficult and hard as that can be in an organization this big, but where there's a place in the work of social justice for every single one of us on this webinar and far beyond. And that means acknowledging, to very badly paraphrase Alice Walker here, that we're not the first or last to struggle. I love that quote. My best friend used to have it like on her mirror, and I would just look at it. You know, I'd look at it all the time and be like, oop, I fell in the hole today. I thought I was walking around acting like I was the first one, first one to learn things, first one to mess up, first one to be coming in. And of course, again, I was not. So I personally know, and I want to say my work would not be possible without the contributions of the two women who spoke to you here today, and without so many other women and people who have done this work. I often said I felt like my journey in organizing was like when you watch National Geographic and there's like that little turtle trying to get to the water, and there's like somebody looking out, right, to make sure the birds don't get them. And it can be a really rough journey. And I feel like for sure I would just be remiss if I would say that it wasn't, you know, women of color in the South and other LGBTQ women and working class women that gave that nod and gave that support and helped move us forward. And that's so much for me about the kind of politic we're trying to build right now. And the work continues. And our responsibility is to be constantly expanding the circle of the us who will do it with us. And this conversation is a reminder for me of that. So I just want to thank you so very much, Barbara and Amy, for being with us, and all of you for joining us today. And I wish you an evening of power, reflection, and rest. Thank you all so much for this time.
May I just say one thing? I have one thing I want to share.
Please.
And I hope it's not too late. If you can't tell, I'm an optimist politically. And this is hard work, very hard work, but the joy and struggle keeps me optimistic. So you will fall into that hole, as Amy said. There's something I want to suggest that people read to find out like how you can keep going. And that is an article that is in one of my books. That book is Homegirls, a Black Feminist Anthology. Homegirls, a Black Feminist Anthology. The last article in the book, on purpose, because I edited the book, is Coalition Politics, Turning the Century. Coalition Politics, Turning the Century by Bernice Johnson Reagan. If you don't read anything else, please read that, because she acknowledges how tough it is to work across differences and why it's so important. So I just wanted to throw that in.
I am so glad you said that, Barbara.
And thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, Amy.
I'm going to read that one this weekend, and we're going to make sure we send that in the follow-up as well. That's such a goodie. I haven't read it in so long. I'm so glad you said it, and I appreciate both of you so much. Y'all take care, okay?
Thank you both. All of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
So long.